The clock on the wall of the House chamber just struck midnight, but for the first time in a long time, the halls of power aren't empty. They're electric. I'm standing here looking at a document that wasn't supposed to exist, a list of names that effectively signals the beginning of the end for the current administration. 140 lawmakers. Let that number sink in. This isn't just a protest anymore. It is a full-scale constitutional uprising. While the rest of the world was sleeping, a coordinated, high-stakes surge took place behind closed doors. We've seen the headlines, we've heard the rumors, but this is different. We are talking about 140 representatives, men and women who have decided that the risk of staying silent is finally greater than the risk of speaking out. They are demanding immediate action, and the charges are heavier than anything we've seen in decades. Imagine the scene. The heavy oak doors of the Speaker's office are practically vibrating with the tension. Outside, federal agents are patrolling the perimeter in a way that feels more like an occupation than protection. Inside, the 140 inches have effectively drawn a line in the sand. They aren't just filing paperwork, they are challenging the very foundation of the imperial presidency. This isn't dry reporting, folks. This is a moment of pure, unadulterated history. They say it's over when the people in the back rooms finally decide they can't look themselves in the mirror anymore. Well, that moment happened at 12:05 a.m. The document was signed, the demand was issued, and the White House response? Dead silence. But that silence is about to be shattered. You can feel it in the air, that static electricity that only comes before a massive storm. They thought they could ignore the 140, but you can't ignore a movement that has the weight of the Constitution behind it. They called it a witch hunt. They called it partisan theater. But when 140 people risk their entire careers on a single demand for immediate accountability, the theater is over. The real battle has begun. But what was actually in that document? What did those 140 lawmakers see that finally pushed them over the edge? What I found in the second paragraph of that demand? Well, it changes everything we thought we knew about the crisis in Minneapolis. The 140 signatures aren't just ink on a page. They are a response to a country that feels like it's being pulled apart at the seams. To understand why these lawmakers finally broke rank, you have to look at the pressure cooker that America has become in the early months of 2026. We aren't just talking about policy disagreements anymore. We are talking about the Insurrection Act being treated like a first resort rather than a last. Look at what's happening on our streets. The fallout from the deadly ICE shootings in Minnesota has left the nation in a state of shock, and the administration's response wasn't to heal, but to threaten. When the president suggested that military personnel should face the ultimate penalty for even questioning an order, the stakes stopped being political. They became existential. That is the second paragraph I mentioned, a direct accusation that the White House is preparing to use the military against American civilians who dare to dissent. But it goes even deeper. Across the globe, the unauthorized military maneuvers against Iran and the bizarre aggressive threats toward Norway over Greenland have left our allies wondering if the US has abandoned the rule of law entirely. For the 140 lawmakers who stood up, this was the red line. They saw a president who no longer feels an obligation to think purely of peace, as he put it in those leaked texts, but instead sees the world as a chessboard for his personal grievances. In my view, we are at a crossroads that our founders warned us about. If 140 people can see the fire and shout burn, why are the rest of the halls of Congress so silent? It's because the cost of truth has never been higher. Those 140 are being called traitors by their colleagues, while the administration labels them enemies of the state. This is the FOMO moment for every American watching. If we look away now, if we let this movement be buried under the 24-hour news cycle, we are effectively saying that the Constitution is a suggestion, not a law. But there is a reason the White House is panicking behind those closed doors. They know that among those 140 names are people who were, until yesterday, his most loyal defenders. What happens next will change the trajectory of the 2026 midterms and the very office of the presidency. But to see how we got here, we have to look at the man who believes he is now above the law, the villain of this drama who thinks he can simply rewrite the rules of the game. To understand why 140 lawmakers finally reached their breaking point, you have to look at the man who believes the rules no longer apply to him. Since his second inauguration, The president hasn't just pushed the boundaries of executive power, he has set them on fire. This isn't the same leader we saw in 2016 or even 2020. This version of the administration operates under a terrifying new doctrine, the imperial presidency, where the only restraint on global power is, in his own words, my own morality. Let's look at the trail of wreckage leading up to this midnight crisis. It started with a series of unilateral military strikes that bypassed Congress entirely. Without a single vote, without a single briefing to the people's representatives, he launched major combat operations against Iran, coordinated not with our own legislature, but with foreign governments. When questioned, the response from the West Wing was chilling. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control. But it wasn't just the illegal wars abroad. It was the war from within. We're talking about the deployment of paramilitary forces against American residents, the terrifying use of the Insurrection Act as a threat against dissent, and a pattern of intimidation against the very judges and lawmakers sworn to uphold the law. From the leaked Greenland texts, where he claimed he no longer felt an obligation to think purely of peace because he was denied a Nobel Prize, to his public calls for the execution of members of Congress, the mask has completely slipped. In my opinion, we are witnessing the height of personal hubris. This is a man who views the US Constitution not as a binding contract, but as a series of suggestions he can ignore whenever they become inconvenient. He has built a wall of loyalty that he thought was impenetrable, surrounding himself with enablers who treat his every whim as law. He truly believed that by consolidating power over the military and the Justice Department, he could silence any voice that dared to say no. He looked at the 140 lawmakers as nothing more than a minor annoyance, a partisan witch hunt that he could simply mock on social media until it went away. He never expected that his own hubris would become the catalyst for his downfall. He thought he was the only player on the board. He didn't realize that while he was busy rewriting the rules, a different kind of leader was preparing to play the game of a lifetime. The stage was set, and the hero of our story was about to walk into the light. While the White House spent the evening dismissing the movement as noise, one man was quietly becoming the architect of their greatest nightmare. Meet Congressman Al Green. If you've followed the long arc of justice in this country, that name should sound familiar. This is a man who doesn't just study the Constitution, he lives it. For years, Green has been the lone voice in the wilderness, filing articles of impeachment when it wasn't popular, when his own party told him to sit down, and when the media called him an outlier. But Al Green isn't an outlier. He's a prophet of accountability. Born into the struggle of the segregated South, he learned early on that dignity isn't something given by a government, it's something you fight for. He spent his career as a judge and a lawyer, learning the language of the law so that one day he could use it to protect the people from the powerful. He's faced threats, he's been mocked on the House floor, and just recently, he was forcibly removed from the chamber during the State of the Union for simply holding a sign that spoke a fundamental truth. Black people aren't apes. In my opinion, Al Green is the hero this moment requires because he doesn't care about the polls, he cares about the precedent. He watched as his colleagues wavered, but he stayed the course, gathering evidence of illegal wars and military attacks on civilians until the pile of proof was too high for anyone to ignore. Those 140 signatures aren't just names, they are the result of Green's relentless, quiet persuasion. He convinced the establishment that the survival of the Republic was worth more than their political safety. He didn't come to Washington to be famous. He came to ensure that the office of the president never became a throne. When he stood at that podium at 2 a.m., he wasn't just representing a district in Texas, he was representing every American who believes that no one, not even a billionaire in the Oval Office, is above the law. He has been the impeachment warrior for a decade, and now he's finally leading the charge with a small army behind him. He has spent a lifetime preparing for this exact confrontation, and as the gavel comes down to start the morning session, Al Green is about to unleash a verbal tactical strike that will leave the administration's defenders speechless. The morning sun hadn't even fully hit the Capitol dome before the House floor transformed into a battlefield. Usually, these sessions start with polite formalities, but today the air was thick with the scent of a coming storm. As the Speaker pro tempore called the House to order, you could see the physical divide. On one side, a Republican leadership determined to hold the line for the president. On the other, a surge of 140 lawmakers who looked like they hadn't slept in 48 hours. The spark that lit the powder keg was the introduction of the impeachment countdown resolution. When the clerk began reading the names of the 140 who had signed on, the jeering started. I watched from the gallery as veteran GOP members shouted shame and traitor across the aisle. But the 140 inches didn't flinch. They sat in a unified block, a silent wall of defiance that seemed to rattle the majority whip more than any shouting match ever could. The debate quickly spiraled into chaos over the Operation Epic Fury strikes in Iran. One ranking member stood up, face flushed with rage, accusing the 140 of stabbing our troops in the back while they're under fire. The response from the impeachment camp was a deafening roar of "the Constitution is the back." Tension reached a breaking point when a freshman representative from the Midwest, someone who had been a loyal Trump supporter just weeks ago, stood up and crossed the aisle to join the 140. The room went dead silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into pure, unbridled bedlam. In my opinion, this was the moment the administration realized they weren't just fighting a fringe group anymore. They were fighting a contagion of conscience. The villain narrative of the 140 being secret Iranians or domestic agitators was crumbling in real time as more members stood up to demand a vote on the War Powers resolution. The GOP leadership was visibly panicking, huddled in the back of the chamber, desperately trying to whip votes that were disappearing like sand through their fingers. The gavel was pounding so hard I thought it might shatter the rostrum, but amidst the screaming and the finger-pointing, Al Green remained the calmest man in the room. He was waiting for his moment, the moment when the noise would die down and the truth would be the only thing left standing. The floor was a hurricane of political survival, but the eye of the storm was about to speak. And when he did, the counterattack he unleashed didn't just target the president's policies, it targeted his very soul. The shouting match in the House chamber didn't just stop, it vanished. The moment Al Green adjusted the microphone, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the room. He didn't scream, he didn't use flashy political buzzwords. Instead, he pulled out a single, thin file, the evidence that 140 lawmakers had risked their careers to see. "You call us traitors?" Green's voice was a low, steady rumble that cut through the tension like a hot knife. "You speak of Operation Epic Fury as a defense of freedom. Let us speak then of the freedom of Renee Good." The mention of the Minneapolis poet, a mother of 3 killed by federal agents just weeks ago, sent a visible shudder through the GOP front bench. Green didn't stop there. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto the cameras. "You say the president has the authority to select the next leader of Iran. I ask this House, since when does the Constitution of the United States grant a king the right to crown a successor in a foreign land, while our own citizens are being labeled terrorists for observing a traffic stop?" The counterattack was a tactical masterclass. He systematically dismantled the administration's peace-through-strength narrative by highlighting the $3.7 billion price tag of the first 100 hours of a war that Congress never authorized. But the real mic drop came when he addressed the firing of Kristi Noem. The president fired his Homeland Security Secretary not for the blood on the streets of Minneapolis, but because she wasn't loyal enough to his illegal orders. He isn't protecting America. He's protecting a regime. The room remained paralyzed. You could see the confidence crumbling on the faces of the president's staunchest defenders. They had prepared for a partisan debate, but Green had brought a moral mirror. He wasn't just arguing law. He was exposing a soul-deep contradiction in the American experiment. As he sat down, he didn't look for applause. He looked at the clock. In my view, that was the precise moment the imperial presidency lost its grip on the narrative. It wasn't about left versus right anymore. It was about right versus wrong. The hero had delivered his blow, and as he walked away from the podium, the silent realization began to spread. The 140 inches were no longer the ones on trial. The counterattack had landed. But as the House went into a forced recess, the real explosion wasn't happening in the chamber. It was happening in the streets, on the screens, and in the very digital fabric of the nation. The gavel hadn't even finished echoing in the House chamber before the digital world went into a state of absolute nuclear fission. We've seen viral moments before, but this was a systemic shock. Within minutes of Al Green's mic drop mention of Renee Good and the unbudgeted $3.7 billion price tag of Operation Epic Fury, The hashtag #140strong wasn't just trending, it was the only thing people were talking about from New York to Tokyo. I watched the feeds in real time. It started with a trickle of TikToks from inside the capital, but it quickly turned into a flood of defiance. We saw videos of active duty service members, their faces obscured for protection, simply nodding in agreement with Green's point about illegal orders. That's the nightmare scenario the White House was terrified of, a military that starts to think for itself. On X, the blue checks and the Annons were actually in agreement for once, dissecting the leaked Greenland texts and the chilling implications of a president who claimed he no longer felt an obligation to think purely of peace. But the real shockwaves weren't just on social media. They were in the halls of global finance. As the news hit that 140 lawmakers were officially moving to block the funding for the Iran strikes, the markets reacted with a Black Monday level of panic. People realized that if the 140 could hold their ground, the imperial presidency would run out of gas, literally. I saw reports of world leaders in the EU and NATO calling emergency sessions, wondering if the US was about to undergo a second revolution at the ballot box or sooner. In my view, the most powerful reaction came from the people who usually don't care about politics. I saw live streams of spontaneous vigils for Renee Good, popping up in cities that weren't even in the news. The 140 lawmakers had done something rare. They had given the people a mirror. They showed the world that we, the people, aren't just a preamble. We are a massive, sleeping giant that has finally been poked with a hot iron. The administration tried to label the 140 as enemies of the state, but the internet responded by making them icons of the republic. The social validation was undeniable. The 140 inches weren't alone anymore. They had millions of eyes watching their every move. But as the sun began to set on this historic day, the question remained, what does this actually mean for the future of America? What is the lesson we are supposed to take away from this chaos? As the sun sets over the Potomac, casting long cinematic shadows across the National Mall, we are forced to look past the hashtags and the frantic stock tickers. What we witnessed today wasn't just a legislative skirmish, it was a heartbeat of the Republic. When 140 lawmakers, many of whom had everything to lose, refused to table the truth, they reminded us that the American experiment is not a spectator sport. It is a living, breathing commitment to the idea that power must always be answerable to the people. In my view, the moral lesson of this crisis is simple yet profound. Dignity is more powerful than fear. The administration tried to use fear as a currency, fear of execution for dissent, fear of illegal orders, and fear of being labeled an enemy of the state. But Al Green and the 140 showed us that when you stand on the firm ground of the Constitution, that fear loses its value. They chose the sacred vehicle of impeachment, not because it was easy, or even because it was guaranteed to succeed in a divided House, but because it was necessary to preserve the soul of the Republic. We often think of justice as something that happens in a courtroom years after the fact. But justice also happens in the moment someone says no to an abuse of power. It happens when a lawmaker from a red district crosses the aisle because they can no longer justify the illegal wars in Iran or the silence over the blood in Minneapolis. That is the inspirational crescendo of this story. The realization that while one man may sit in the Oval Office, the authority of that office belongs to us. This isn't about being a Democrat or a Republican. It's about being an American who believes that no one is above the law. The 140 inches have given us a roadmap back to accountability. They showed us that even in an era of imperial presidencies and shadow dockets, a small group of determined people can still shake the foundations of the world. As we reflect on this day, let's not remember the chaos, let's remember the courage. Let's remember that the light of truth doesn't just reveal the cracks in our system, it shows us how to mend them. The title of this video wasn't clickbait. It's over. Not because the ink is dry on an impeachment conviction, but because the illusion of absolute unchecked power has finally shattered. When 140 lawmakers stand up and say enough, the imperial presidency loses its most potent weapon, the consent of the governed. We are witnessing a crisis that has deepened into a historic reckoning, and there is no going back to the way things were before that midnight document was signed. But here is the most important part. This story doesn't end when I stop talking. It continues with you. The 140 lawmakers did their part in the House chamber. But the real power has always lived in the streets, in the town halls, and in the digital town square where you are watching this right now. If we want justice for the illegal wars, if we want accountability for what happened in Minneapolis, we cannot let the news cycle bury this moment. In my view, this is the most critical juncture in our lifetime. We've seen the heroes, we've seen the villains, and we've seen the courage it takes to stand in the gap. Now I'm asking you to be part of that movement. If you believe that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law, then you need to make your voice heard. Here is what you need to do right now. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. We are tracking every signature and every development in this impeachment crisis daily. Don't let the mainstream media filter the truth for you. Share this video, send it to one person who needs to see the reality of the #140 strong movement. Comment below. Do you stand with the 140, or do you think this is a step too far? I read every single comment because your identity and your story are what this republic is built on. The 140 inches have taken their stand. Now it's your turn. Let's keep the light of the Constitution burning bright. I'll see you in the next update.